Hello, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine, Content Specialist for the Florida Joint Center for Citizenship, which is part of the School of Politics, Security, and International Affairs at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. Welcome to our Middle School Civics Highlights series. Today we look at benchmark CG 3.6, in which we will analyze how the 13th, 14th, 15th, 19th, 24th, and 26th Amendments broaden participation in the political process. In Part 1, we focus on the constitutional amendments that expanded civil rights to African Americans, women, and young people. We will focus on benchmark clarification 1, in which students will recognize how these amendments expanded civil rights to African Americans, women, and young people. We will ask the question, how have these amendments expanded civil rights to these three groups? You see before you a chart, and on that chart each of the 6 amendments that are included in the benchmark are presented, as well as the ratification date. We see that the first of these 6 amendments was ratified in 1865. For those of you who are good historians, you will note that the 13th Amendment was ratified in the same year that the Civil War ended. That amendment made slavery unconstitutional, which means that the only way to change any amendment, including this one, would be to change the Constitution again. So this was very different from earlier efforts to outlaw slavery that could have been overturned by one or more branches of government. The 14th Amendment says that anyone born in the United States is a U.S. citizen, and as a U.S. citizen they are granted the same rights as all other U.S. citizens. And so we see the buildup post-Civil War of first making certain that African Americans could no longer be enslaved, then granting citizenship to former slaves, as well as all other persons who had been denied citizenship before who had been born in the United States. 1870 now grants voting rights to all U.S. citizens regardless of their race. That's the 15th Amendment. With the 19th Amendment, voting rights were expanded to women. Prior to 1920, states could decide whether or not women had the right to vote, but those rights were limited to local and state elections that were under the responsibility of the state and local governments. With the 19th Amendment, women could not be denied the right to vote in elections, whether the election was a federal office, state office, or local office. In 1964, the 24th Amendment addressed an issue that was limiting voting rights to certain individuals. There were individuals who were required to pay poll taxes, and for some individuals, those persons could not afford to pay poll taxes. A poll tax is paying a tax in order to vote. And thus there were groups that were denied their voting rights who were U.S. citizens and could not have been denied their voting rights on that basis. They were old enough to vote, they met residency requirements, and they met registration requirements. But still, when they went to vote, they were told that they had to pay a poll tax. And the 24th Amendment eliminated that requirement. Then in 1971, the 26th Amendment was ratified, and that amendment lowered the minimum voting age for all U.S. citizens. Before 1971, the federal government and some states only allowed those 21 and older to vote, and that change that occurred in 1971 now included individuals who were adults in other areas of the law, but they did not have the right to vote. We're now going to turn our attention to some visuals focusing on the rights that we've just discussed. So here we have a political cartoon from the National American Women's Suffrage Association fighting for women's right to vote, and here we see individual messages focusing on people's objections to women securing voting rights. So here there was concern about what will save the home, and the National American Women's Suffrage Association said votes for women. Certainly they're saying unemployment for men breaks up the home, bad employment for women and children breaks up the home, and consequently the easiest way to address these economic concerns as they relate to men, women, and children, which was to give votes to women. So here they're saying what breaks up the home is not voting rights. What breaks up the home are economic concerns. What saves the home is to give votes to women. Here we see a map of the southern United States showing which states had poll taxes as of April 1941. So this was then about 24 years before poll taxes were brought into, made to be unconstitutional. So here we see that when states had the power to decide whether or not to impose a poll tax, that most states in the South indeed levied means to impose, imposed a poll tax. So we see most states in the South did impose a poll tax, although it was probably close to half, and this was in 1941. This shows us that when states did have the right to impose a poll tax, many of them did. And thus we see the decision in 1971 as it relates to the 26th Amendment. Now, in the early 1960s, the draft process was heating up because of the U.S.'s involvement in the conflict between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. The United States government was supporting South Vietnam, and North Vietnam, as a communist country, was seeking to take over South Vietnam, and the United States was helping South Vietnam defend itself. In order to do that, many individuals, men, were drafted. They could be drafted at age 18, and this mandatory requirement that these men serve in the war caused them to question why it is that they didn't have the right to vote. Why was it that they did not have voting rights when it came to deciding who was elected to Congress? Congress has the power to raise and support armies. Who the commander-in-chief was, that's the president. Why were they denied the right to select the very people who made decisions as to whether or not they were going to be fighting in the war between North Vietnam and South Vietnam? So what you see in front of you is a protest button, and that protest button focuses on this message. Why am I old enough to fight, but I'm not old enough to vote? So in order to bring these concerns into line, the voting age was lowered to age 18 with the 26th Amendment in 1971. Thank you for joining me for Middle School Civics Highlights. Do you still have questions? Please contact us using the information that appears on the screen. Till next time, I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine. Thank you for joining me.